There is a lot of people in Egypt that live in some sort of victim mentality where they would like to put all their, how do I say it, most of the things that are not going well on the shoulders of others, right? Living in a victim mentality, basically. Do you think that religion plays a role in such an act?
Oh, absolutely. Religion is, I think, in my opinion, the sole reason why the victim mentality is so nice and so attractive. Because you think that there's a point to suffering. It always boils down to this like weird abstract philosophy, which I do not quite understand. So I'm not gonna say much about. But I will say that there is a hadith that says, um, "Al-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir," which means that if if you're suffering in the dunya in the current life, then that means that you're actually a mu'min. I mean, it doesn't mean that directly, but it does mean that indirectly, right? Like you have a need, you feel more fulfilled through suffering, and I
Mhm.
think it means that you don't try to fix yourself, so it becomes more perpetual, right? Um, but also the environment, I think, is to blame. Like the environment in Egypt is getting worse, I think, in the past few years. So
Mhm.
yeah.
So the more you suffer, the more you would win in the judgment day or the heaven or hell or when the day come, right? That's usually how they think.
Yes, I think so, and it's really sad because before religion was such a thing in countries like, especially if you go to other African countries that aren't so religious and like still believe in like magic and witchcraft and whatever. I mean, of course, some of these beliefs are limiting, but what I notice is that these people understand that there is nobody coming to save them, and at the end of the day, like you have to put in the work. You know, um, we're currently seeing signs of like urban hell, of wealth inequality. Of course, wealth inequality is something that is outside of our control, but just because you don't have money doesn't mean you have to suffer. There are levels to it, and there's also levels of affordability in Egypt. Like, you know how there's like a Misr and then there's an Egypt, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are levels of affordability. Um, so I think that if we stop having that mentality of suffering, which is inherent in religion, and this is unfortunately something I don't think people lose when they claim that they're an atheist. So it's something that you know needs to be kind of put into perspective.
Interesting. So you're saying there's some people who left religion and they still stick with this victim mentality, or you have to suffer in life to win something?
Yes, I think it actually gets worse when you become an atheist, and this is why the rates of depression is skyrocketing when people become atheist in societies where there is material problems, right? Because you have two forms of atheism. The one where you're in the upper class and therefore you realize that like you've made it, you don't need to pray to a god. And then there's the one where everything is just so terrible that you just become nihilistic. And I think that that's quite dangerous. And since you live in Egypt, you can also agree that there's a lot of atheists in Egypt that there's no justification for it. There's no God that's going to reward them at the end of it, you know?
Okay, so does that mean for certain people religion is actually good because it gives them some sort of an end goal to life so they wouldn't get depressed or something?
In selfish philosophical terms, maybe. I don't like that. I don't like the idea of letting Egypt rot and become full of trash on the streets because oh, life is shit, so I'm going to, continue in this urban hell phenomenon, or like, just think that because I don't have 30,000 Egyptian pounds every month, that I'm going to suffer. I think that some people will consider it good on a personal level, but I think that if harnessed correctly, if you understand atheism on the correct way, you can actually harness it to your own benefit.
There is also something that usually Arabs like to do, which is believe in the conspiracy theories. And they are not one or two, there is a lot of them. Mainly the ones where they would say that the corruption in our country, in the Arab countries, are based on external factors coming from, say, the United States or Europe or maybe Israel, maybe. And therefore, we are getting targeted and it's not our fault, right?
This is a big problem because conspiracy is always rooted in truth, and I think that a lot of conspiracy theories are just simply things that we don't like. The mainstream narrative just doesn't want to acknowledge, and yes, it does feed into the victim mentality. I think that two things can be true at once. Like, we can acknowledge um, that Egypt is being sabotaged by the West, and we can also acknowledge that we still have power, and it doesn't, and like, obviously we don't want to end up like another Syria. Like, you don't want to, I don't think it's always like the ultimate, like, let's believe in democracy again, let's try do this again. I think we need to have a more holistic approach to kind of opting out of these systems. Um, obviously it's difficult, and I think further down the line we'll start talking about a little bit more solutions to this. Um, but the but just because Muslims believe in something doesn't mean I'm so quick to dismiss it, especially when it comes to when it has to do with the material reality of Egypt.
Egypt, in a long period of time, was under a lot of colonizations from the West, from Europe, from a lot of places. I would say we only had our independence like, I don't know, like 60 or 80 years ago, and we mostly had a colonization in Egypt, and most likely this kind of colonization left some effects in the culture, in the ways of thinking, in how we interact with one another, right? So, have you ever thought of that?
Yes, actually, this is a very, very interesting topic, and thanks for bringing it up. Um, Unfortunately, because my Arabic literacy isn't that great, I'm only limited to reading what the British have to say about Egypt, um, instead of reading it from the inside perspective. But what I do kind of think happened is the rise of like a weird quasi-nationalist belief. Back then, they would call them the Effendis. They were like very, very religious types. And I like to think, based on my knowledge, which again, I have not read this in Arabic, and I have not read an Arabic perspective on this one. Based on my knowledge, I think that the British were quite fond of that idea that the society is judging itself and it's creating its own caste system. Because you have to think that, like, during what the image of a Muslim was 200 years ago was someone who dabbled in sciences and someone who spoke 3 to 4 languages, and there was this kind of European Union style country back then, and then you have now, when you think of the word Muslim, you think of what Americans have to say about Islam, as in like 9/11. Yeah, it's always this American narrative that we have today. So how we went from there to there, I think was definitely a conscious choice in the change of the narratives. So you had the kind of like a post-colonial era, like a conscious shift of the image of Muslims from people of knowledge, or people who had something to give to the West, to now terrorists or extras or something. Um, you had the specifically in Egypt, and this is very only specific to Egypt, the rise of sexual harassment and the rise of loitering and the rise of just yelling on the street, littering in the street. This started from the days, I think the late days of the Ottoman Empire, I think, because I only can see it documented in British, British literature, where
Mm.
they would say like, okay, so I'll just give you an example. They would write stories about, street vendors, people who sell things on the street, and they're yelling. So then what they would do is they would arrest these people. And back then, hitting people was an acceptable form of policing. So they would do that, and then put them back on the street. And then it's like a constant cycle of they will continue to break the law because you made them, and then you just like make them like charge them with negative energy and then just put them back on the street, right? And I think Egypt today inherited all of the tactics that were used back then without any kind of respect for the person. Like back then, at least you could say, okay, but these were foreigners, this was a foreign invasion. But now, it is your own people doing it.
Back then, at the time of the colonization, they really didn't care about their environment because they were under control of an external force. But right now, they still kept the traits of not respecting the environment around them from back in the days, right?
Yes, yes, definitely. And it's definitely a two-sided thing because on one side you have the populace who is a victim in that sense, and then you also have the government, which is just does not represent the people even after the British left. So that's kind of because I've talked to a lot of people in Egypt, and I
Mhm.
told them like, why are you littering? And then they would say something along the lines of, but I don't like the current president, or but this doesn't represent me. I'm like, okay, but the current president's not gonna walk on your street, which you are littering in your own neighborhood.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but they have nothing to say, and it's just a perpetual, like, I think it's a generational problem.
People who believes that it's not their country anymore, is there
Hmm.
something we can talk to them about that would somewhat change their mind and convince them in one way or another that what they're doing is not, like it's not efficient, right?
Hmm. Yes, yes, definitely. There has to be more than just like I will talk to people as if I'm talking down to them, right? Because every time I ask Egyptians, what do you think is wrong with Egypt and what do you think we can change Egypt? They will always say something along the effects of education. People need to be educated,
Mm-hmm.
people need to be told. And it's a little bit demeaning to come and say, oh, I'm going to educate you. um, I think that there has to be more of a community thing because the urban communities, when especially when you have such a big metropolitan, right? And then you have people coming from other cities, and these people also disrespect the space because there's a lot of anger. Like, why is all the money concentrated here? Why don't I have that? Like, there has to be more of a conscious community building choice. This is not something that happens like where like I wake up one day and go and pick up a sign or like go and teach people that littering is wrong. I think it's more of a practice that has to be consciously made, and we have to connect to our neighbors. We have to connect to people that also have a vested interest in the street that we want to keep clean.
Sure, I do agree with your point there. I think it have to become something you do it unconsciously. It have to be something deeply rooted in them, and it's not gonna come in a one day or another, right? There is also a phenomena that we usually see in Egypt where people would see, especially people who are religious, right? They would look to suffering as a virtue, as something good, as something that ascends sends them to a higher place, right? What do you think of that?
It's terrible. I mean, it's especially terrible for everyone involved. But the biggest example is women. A lot of like when you think of an Egyptian woman, you think a person who is suffering, a sacrificial mother. You know that image of like the Virgin Mary kind of image, like sacrificial mother, that kind of stuff there. And it leads to a toxic thing because you cannot live this unfulfilled life and then you start living through your sons and your children, and then it's a collective psychosis in a way. So yeah, there's that problem, right? Like you see that with mothers, and then you also see that with, of course, we already discussed a little bit the environment. So there's a complete disregard for the environment. You've had the desertification of Egypt after, like, the beginning of the post-colonial era, and nobody cares anymore. Nobody does anything about it anymore. It's just, it's just they think that Egypt is doomed, and the only thing that has to happen is leaving it. And it's like, but you're 110 million. How do you expect that to happen? Why do you have to wait until someone else, some random person builds real estate that looks amazing, but it's never going to be affordable to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, ex-Muslims also have this. Ex-Muslims absolutely think that they should not try to change their environment, and I've had I've tried so hard to get that point across. Um, but it just seems like if we keep talking about abstractions, and this is the thing, people want to suffer because then they can go to the mosque and they can go to the church and they can feel like they're not the only person dealing with it. But with ex-Muslims, we don't have our own temple, right? So what do you have? Like it's way more useless to suffer in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's all negative, right? Because right now, if you open Facebook, there's a lot of events around like mental health, around like mothers also. They're discussing, toxic traits and toxic femininity and stuff like that. So there are actual secular spaces in Egypt, and I think that would be the natural progression of suffering, which is to suffer together. And that's what mosques do very well because then you meet. And this is what maybe there should be more spaces where we suffer together, especially secular spaces.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people that would want to leave Egypt because they are not seeing any signs of hope, and they are people who are extremely religious, and there is also the people who are ex-Muslim or ex-religious people. So it's not about religion when it comes to the sense of the doomerism that surrounds a lot of people here in Egypt. It's more, you know, that they lost hope in making Egypt a better place, and the I think the energy needed to change is so much more than just to try to leave the place. And usually people will tend to go to the thing that consume less energy.
Why do you think that? I mean, I don't personally think that because I think that when you're trying to attain something that's so much more difficult to actually achieve, I think that they're just like chasing a high, but they're never actually gonna get there.
Yeah, you could say so. What I mean is to change a country or change culture, to change into a better place, it takes a lot of effort. You can just leave if you live in a go live in a place that has more suitable life condition, then you're winning on an individual level. So why would they do the extra effort in their country, right? That's what I think people do or believe in when it comes to the living condition here in Egypt.
Yeah.
Again, I would also say that a lot of people here in Egypt do not realize that leaving the country could be a solution for some people, but also not for all of them. But we have, I think, in Egypt, we have this huge hype around leaving Egypt. Like the post picture of being in the airport, and they finally made it out of Egypt, and hooray, we got out. You know, like the fantasize about leaving Egypt to the point where they probably will be disappointed that the world is not that shiny place outside of Egypt. Most people never left Egypt, and they see all the people around them. They want to leave, so why not me too, right?
Hmm. Yeah. And this is the saddest thing because most people won't. That's one thing. And the second thing is that a lot of these people, they just want to go and then they want to go back to their habits because leaving, like the act of doing something that's, big, big reward, something that like just happens once. You don't have to actually form a habit for it. But if you want to live in a community and you want to like consciously enjoy Egypt and you want to like, become spiritual, a lot of it sounds a lot of people get turned off by that. Like, for example, like just waking up and actually appreciating things. Um, so that actually reminds me, the spiritual practices that I kind of adopt and really help me like understand Egypt a lot more is gratitude, right? Like you wake up and there is beauty in the country, and this is why there are so many foreign powers that are trying to take it away. But with the Islamic perspective, you wake up and you say the afkar, which basically just like reinforce that you're a slave to God, and they reinforce negative beliefs. And I don't think that traveling will change people as much as they think that they're going to change. I've seen it way too many times. There's even an article now about people who ran away from the Taliban, people who ran away from the Iranian regime, and then they go to places that are not very Islam friendly, and then they say, "Oh, but we want our kids to wear the hijab, like our school kids, very young and cannot make their own decisions." So I think people really put a lot of people don't want to come to terms with the fact that their habits could be self-destructive and could have their own problems. Because how many times is it that when I go talk to an atheist in Egypt, they would tell me, and I talk about like spirituality or yoga or just something that isn't expensive. It's not really expensive, but really helps with your mind and your health and all that stuff. I always get treated with immediate rejection and of the idea and immediate like disdain, like how dare you even say that. There's just the belief that because someone is economically suffering, then it's also right to neglect your health and right to neglect your mental health until it's kind of like you're fasting until the thing happens that you want to happen.
You have mentioned urban health phenomena a couple of times, and I wanna
Mhm.
like investigate more into what exactly is urban phenomena in Egypt and what kind of affects affects the people of Egypt. If you can like describe a couple of examples of urban hell for you, that would be also great.
Yes. So actually, you told me this before we started recording, but you told me that there used to be more parks in Cairo, and that in the past few years they started disappearing. I think that's very interesting because we should probably start with the fact that there is the government aspect, and that like there's a lot of aspects where we cannot control something. I remember the Maadi trees that were cut down because of some foreign investor, some Arabian investor or something. So yes, we can first start by acknowledging that there are factors outside of our control, but there's a lot that there isn't. So, for example, I'll start with the men. There's a lack of hygiene in men. Men don't try to be responsible, but to be responsible to themselves. There's a lack of personal responsibility in youth. So they will not. They'll be unkempt. They will. Well, not every demographic of young men has this, but some demographics would bully and sexually harass men if they take care of themselves. There's also so there's that aspect. And then you have the agoraphobia in women. Agoraphobia, very interesting term. It's basically when someone is scared of going out. And I realized a lot of women in Egypt or Cairo, I actually don't know about the other people, the other villages, but in Cairo, they would be afraid of going out at night, or if they go out, they always have something to do, right? They do not loiter like men do, right? And here's why I think that's bad. From a normal perspective, from like a egalitarian society perspective, I think that they should enjoy more spaces. But if we look at the problem with men as well, then there is less incentive to date. And I'm very thankful that the younger generation is I see a lot more of the younger people taking care of themselves and going out and hanging out. But most of society doesn't let women loiter or do nothing. Women always have an obligation to their home, to their parents, to the patriarch of the house. So it would be the parent or the patriarch, or it would be your husband. So it's like before you get married, you have to be the model girl for any husband that comes around. And then once you get married, it's up to luck if he's a good guy, if he's a bad guy. But like out of respect, you should probably abandon your friends. So
Mm-hmm.
that decreases society, and then like now we know each other less in the urban community, right? Yeah. So that's the second thing. So one side is the lack of personal responsibility in men, in young men, and then agoraphobia in women.
I think the recent Uber incident is not really helping the case of, young women going out. They are afraid of their security.
Yeah, that was a terrible one too. Yeah.
I would love to see more women going out in public places and, not having a lot of restriction and whatnot. But there is a lot of issues that Egypt suffer when it comes to women going outside. I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's an awful thing, of course, but they are scared. That's the logical response out of the things they hear. So I'm not really sure how we could change something like that. How we could give women more confident in going out, or if there is something the government or the people have to do to try to combat women suffering from agoraphobia.
Yes. Yeah, agoraphobia. Yes. Okay. But I just want to let you know, this is not the first time we've seen this problem, right? Like
Mhm.
you've seen it in the 70s when the religious people said that they would do corrective harassment to get women to wear the hijab. It's like a constant game of cat and mouse. And this is why you will see people on the internet that are laughing at this woman and saying that they're oppressed because of their class. And that's a whole another level of religious stupidity. Actually, there's a quote by James Connolly, and it's usually used within the socialist construct, but it goes like this. It goes like the worker is the slave of capitalist society. The female worker is the slave of that slave. And this is kind of the something that unfortunately the people in power are okay with. They're okay with men laughing at women being in danger. But
Mhm.
I think that women. Another problem with the urban hell is the reliance on cars, right? People who live in areas where they don't rely on cars, they have more power in that sense. And unfortunately, rich people just have to lock themselves up and then have to rely on cars. And it's like, you know, yeah, it sucks. But I think we if there are more women on the street, you will see less of that happening, because then men do not have a kind of monopoly on driving or um, on these kind of spaces. Actually, the decreased use of public spaces was another part of the urban hell phenomenon that we have power to change, right? So, this is a personal story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when I was first in Egypt, I was so surprised at how dirty the streets were. I was like, "What is this? What is going on?" I did not read about how dirty it was, so that was very shocking to me. And then I thought I had a conspiracy theory. I thought that there was a secret political party that is just hell bent on making the streets dirty or something. So I wanted to test my theory, and I would walk in spaces that are a little bit walkable, right? Like, for example, you'd see a patch of grass at a roundabout, something that should be kept clean.
Mm-hmm.
Why the fuck would you put something on there? And I just, just like loitered around, just did nothing, and kind of observed people, seeing what they do. I had a notebook. I was testing my hypothesis if it's a secret political party, and then, to my surprise, it was every walk of life that was littering. And I was so surprised. It was young people, it was old people, it was uber religious people, it was laborers. So I was very, very confused. And that kind of put my theory to rest, because it wasn't really a specific group, right? Um, However, that kind of decreases the public use spaces. So every tiny green space would be, used up by littering, or there would be just a disrespect to grass, making any little patch of grass like die. That wasn't very productive, right? That's not very nice. And yes, you could argue that the government should hire more people, and more janitorial staff, and more gardening staff, and we're not a compound, and we can't afford this and whatever. But also, it should be a two-sided thing, in my opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I heard also, I'm not actually sure this is true, but I heard that some people steal the entire garbage can if it's not bolted down. But in general, there is a decreased use of public spaces. It's not just the littering problem. It's like everything is filled with cars. There's just there used to be streets where there's no horses back in the day, and there shouldn't be cars. This kind of stuff is going away. The idea of communal spaces is kind of going away, and this is really sad. And this is something that can be consciously brought to light, because instead of waiting to go out at the mall, or instead of like every street being completely filled with gawking men who are smoking and just like making the street just an unusable space for everyone else, we could have communal spaces, right? We could have a little like picnic space or something that is aesthetically pleasing than just like the concrete place, and then just like a men's only cafe type thing.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
is also a huge increase in coffee shops where, since there is no gardens, there is no public parks, you will have to go to a coffee shop, and it became the go-to place where you could meet people, it's not that bad, but I wouldn't replace it with gardens and public parks, right?
If you mean like the coffee shops that are like inviting spaces, and I'm noticing a lot of them have art, something artistic in there, something very, very beautiful and interesting decorum, or an interesting aesthetic they're sticking to. I think in its principle it's all right, but it's more of a gated thing, because when you enter that space to hang out, you're gonna pay.
Mm-hmm.
So of course there has to be it's a two-way thing. Like, I think the government has to give us more communal spaces, so spaces without cars. And then there also has to be these venues and shops, and outdoor seating areas, and I'm fully of the opinion that the owners of these, not those like qahwa shops, not those like men's spaces, but the owners of the coffee shops that cater to the youth, the ones that like care about art. I think if you gave them the ability to be in a public space and have an outdoor seating area and a garden and stuff like that, I think they would take care of it. And I think that this is actually a good thing, because then you're giving the responsibility of caring for a public space to business owners.
Yeah, and since the government is not doing a great job, probably the business owner would do.
Yes, actually. Another story. Another thing is, I found a group of hipsters, I guess, who would clean like some streets, certain streets. I could just like go and do this with them, and they do it like periodically, so like maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, depending on how fast things got. Eventually, it just became clean enough that they just have to give it a visit, a quick sweep, and everything's fine. But when I was like joining these activities, I noticed people would be ridiculing me for being, the only woman between them. So that was really, really weird.
Hmm.
But if you're in a group and you have an activity to do, I mean, these people weren't my friends or anything, right? Like, I think that strengthens your mental immune system in a way, right? I feel like you've done something.
Yeah, so
Oh,
there were some kind of discrimination because you were a woman and most of them were men.
yes, men do have kind of unrestricted access to the public sphere, and I think women need to push and go in more. If not for because if, for example, right, quoting your story, and I'm not making this about like blaming the victim, like I'm not saying like all women are victims, right?
Mhm.
But I'm saying if one woman is out on the street alone, there is a higher probability of men looking, right? But if women are just a standard part of the street, and that doesn't mean that they're going to a place or coming from a place, right? That they actually have something to do in the street, that they have uh, like community work, or like they have their outdoor seating area just like men do. If they do that, then there will be less problems, right? Women need to collectively start hanging out in the street more and start having stuff to do that doesn't involve spending money.
Yeah, so women are afraid of going out, but to somewhat one of the ways to solve this issue is to actually go out in groups.
Exactly, and thankfully, it's not just like ex-Muslim men, but also like there are a lot of men who be would be like give you that kind of safety that you need. So there are groups, for example, the the Cairo runners, these kinds of spaces. They're extremely welcoming. If you know about community cleanup, if you join an outdoor sports group, biking, these things are great examples of community. There's also community you can achieve through buying stuff technically, but for example, the gardens. So sometimes some gardens in Cairo would host a market, or they would host some kind of event, and these events are usually group activities. Like think about it like this: you, the person listening to this podcast, should think of yourself as both a teacher and a student. And as a teacher, you're making a trip for yourself. And you should take yourself out on that trip. And this trip should be something that, is within the school, the school's limits, right? The school's funds. Like, think of it as you have an obligation to yourself to touch grass.
Okay, so there is a saying in Egypt that usually a lot of people would like to say, and I think it could be somewhat related to the victim mentality we discussed earlier. And that saying is البعد عن الدين هو السبب في المصايب دي. Usually a lot of people would say that that's the actual reason all the bad things in happening in the country is related to especially the youth, are not following the religion traditions, right? So have you encountered something of this nature?
Oh, this makes me so angry to hear. I feel like we kind of moved on a little bit because this makes me feel like I kind of want to have a little bit of, it makes me vengeful. That's what I would say. And I always feel like if I am to go back to the other point, I'm sorry about that, about the urban health phenomenon. I think that the Muslims contribute to it with their constant harassment. I think there was a video on Facebook once about like a guy just like physically assaulting another guy and just to read the Quran to him and ask him, "Hey, do you pray? Like, I'm so much better than you because I'm an educated piece of shit, and you're a povo who doesn't know what prayer is, right?" It does come from the classism, the Effendi phenomenon we've talked about earlier. I think and this is gonna sound really petty, but what I started doing in the sense of like reclaiming spaces and reclaiming the urban hell is that I started shaming people, publicly shaming people for littering, for vandalism, for hitting animals. These are the three things I would publicly shame people of doing. If verbal harassments exist everywhere from these very nice Muslims, and I will also shame them for when they do something bad, right? I think that this is the ultimate revenge that we have, is especially if not just as a woman, not just as an ex-Muslim, but just like as a youth, as a youth, even if you're Muslim, even if you're Christian listening to this, the ultimate revenge that you have for those elders who ruin society is to enjoy the public space, is to enjoy the dunya, is to appreciate dunya, is to consciously consciously go out there and tell them that they're stupid. So when someone says that sentence specifically, I will just tell them, what have you done? What have you went and cleaned the Nile? I don't think you have. I don't think you've done anything actually. I think you're stupid. I think you're lazy.
Those people would vouch that we have to suffer. But if doing the opposite of that annoys them, then we should do that.
Exactly. That's reclaiming the dunya. Because if they want to have the akhirat, and they want to always wake up and reaffirm themselves that they're slaves, okay, let them. But that's not my country. That's not where I'm living.
So we set the rules.
They can have the akhirat if they don't want the dunya. They can give it to us instead of ruining it for everyone.
We talked a little bit about there is some sort of class issue in Egypt where there is a lot of people who are very poor and a lot of people who are very rich, and they are very disconnected from another. And I think this phenomena will have some sort of an effect on the long run. Do you think that?
Um, do you think the effect will be more positive or negative?
Well, I personally I don't really know, but I believe it will have an effect. It will shift the perspective of a lot of people, and some people might not be able to relate to one another, and that could be an issue since we are still living in the same place somewhat. So if you cannot relate to one another, that's an issue, I guess.
You know what Egypt usually says to the Western audience is it usually says that the metropole is just so overcrowded and that's why they're building unaffordable real estate, right? But they, despite my kind of like hatred for compounds today, I do think that they are a positive and they are a net positive because they do have, especially like the more elite ones, like the bigger ones, right? They have walkable, carless spaces. And yes, they do have the boring American infrastructure. And, we know Americans can't build for shit. But they also have a little bit of like actual walkable spaces, which is very good. And I think it's a net positive because it does create something. Like, for example, the slums, the Cairo slums, the fact that they were relocated to a project. And
Mhm.
my God, that project is a compound, right? It's a very, very high quality accommodation. And if you compare it to the projects of the 80s, the 90s in the West, if you compare it to like what we have in Britain, this is a completely different level. This is on a way bigger scale, right? I know a lot of people complain that these people are now in some kind of like debt, and the government isn't actually trying to uplift them. I mean, you could argue that, but you're not the one living without electricity and connection to, water and sewage. I think I think it's so embarrassing to me when I see a middle class person identify with extreme poverty and act like they know what's in the best interest of someone living in a slum. But we do have like the negative, the disconnect. I mean, Egypt has extreme wealth inequality. It's, you know, Cairo is the second largest city in the all of Africa, right? The biggest one would be in Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria. But you can see parallels between Egypt and some, West African nations that have the same problem, right? Like there's no infrastructure outside of the capital. So in the countryside, there are people that still also don't have proper water connection, or the power cuts now because of the load shedding. The power cuts based on how nice of an area you live. That's not very nice. Um, but I do think a class war is far away, right?
Okay, have you also heard about when an election comes, some in some places they would give some sort of a package to people to try to convince them to vote for some particular person. And usually, if the person is in dire need of this resource pack, they would go and take it, and they will literally sell their voice. And there is a lot of places where that happen. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have a very unconventional opinion here because a lot of people will come and say, "Oh, this is bad and this is not democracy." But I mean, I think I care more about people having material conditions than having democracy, right? Like the amount of poverty, right? It is insane in Egypt. And before we had the election care package, back when there was the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood had like people who lived in every district, like actually lived there. It's not like they were just like working there or something. And they would know who was an orphan or who had a disability or who was basically in need of benefits. And they created their own social benefit system where instead of they're not like giving charity and like, here you go, I'll just give you like £20 because I feel like, or like I'm so good. They give it to them as if it's, a right for them, and it was kind of like a shadow government operation, which I guess the government wanted to get rid of. But then now they are giving poor people like a one-time gift in exchange for them to come and like humiliate themselves in front of urbanites. But here's the thing, right? Um, the urbanites, the middle class people who pretend like they're better than all of this, they don't go and create a social, like they don't actually give to the poor. They don't know what's going on. Like if we're not organizing, and this is sadly, I know a lot of uber religious people like Salafists who actually try and create that social benefit system that the Muslim Brotherhood had, but the normal people do not do that. And I know that it's a lot of effort. A group called, I think, Risala. They're the ones that do this in a more secular note. But there's always some kind of obstacle from the government, right? However, I will have to say I am for the poor getting anything, even if it is for nefarious reasons, because I simply do not invest my time in going out and reaching out to the poor and making sure that they have some kind of social benefits. So therefore, I will not criticize the government on that.
Okay, interesting perspective. One more thing when it comes to the segregation we have in Egypt. There is a lot of people who would say common phrase that we have Egypt and we have Misr, and they basically
Mhm.
mean that there is a lot of segregation between the poor and the rich. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's quite nice. It's quite funny actually, and I know a lot of people. I think I used to try and do this, like, try and identify more with Misr than like with Egypt. Um, but ultimately, I think it's gonna be. I think it's fine. Like, I think we're all in this together. I think the story of that woman who took an Uber from a compound to another compound, I think it's proof enough that there is no real. Um, at the end of the day, like, we're all in this together. But yes, I do notice um, that domestic tourism is becoming more unaffordable. Like, especially, I mean, like, upper middle class domestic tourism, right? It is
Mhm.
becoming unaffordable. The middle class is kind of getting pushed down, and then there is no true middle class tourism. So like, you're either going to like the spaces where there could be crime for tourism, or you're going to a space where you're not allowed, you cannot go if you don't have a car or if you don't have, 100 connections. And yeah, it's definitely, there is definitely like more. That's like a trend that always happens, right? Like, the middle class is always being pushed down for the
Mhm.
past, like, ever since capitalism's conception.
All right, so a lot of old people, I am saying a lot of time, a lot of people, because I think the new generation are starting to think outside the box. They have a lot of exposure to the outside world. So I'm targeting by my question here towards people who are a little bit older. And old people, when they see younger generation are trying to act different, they usually go to saying that they are being westernized. They are, like بيقلدوا الغرب تقليد أعمى وخلاص. Which it, it also comes to the fact that Western people are usually are not religious, and the fact there is a lot of, we're starting to see a lot of people who are ex-Muslim. They would say that you're only doing that because you want to be like a slave to the West, right? So have you encountered such a case?
Considering the fact that I am Western, I encounter it to a bigger degree, to a completely different thing, where like I can get away with so much that an Egyptian cannot get away with, because they don't clock me as they clock me as like, yeah, foreigners can do whatever they want. But the response to your question directly, I think it's embarrassing. It's so funny when they say that, right? Because Egypt was never in isolation, and the Muslim countries that are not trying to be westernized, the minute a Muslim country does well, they usually become more secular, and the image of Islam and this kind of like, putting dirt on yourself and looking dirty and stuff disappears. Like, look at Iraq before the Iraq War. Look at Turkey now. Look at Pakistan. May sound uh, like it's more, religious,
Mm-hmm.
but compared to like 100 years ago, like, during its conception, the people, the diaspora, are way more religious than the actual country. So it's more of a natural progression because, if the country's doing well. But it's so funny to me when they say that this is some kind of westernization, when statistics of which country watches porn the most, which you could say porn is a Western phenomenon. It's actually Muslim countries more than secular countries.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just the pot calling the kettle black at that point. You know.
Mm-hmm.
This is my own personal theory, but I do think that the West definitely promoted more like during the colonial era. They definitely wanted people to be more religious, and they believed that like secular society is a sign of upperclassmanship, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of reserved to themselves. It was around the colonial era. You see, it wasn't that. intense in Egypt, but you could see like examples of that within French Africa and like Christianity. You know, they first spread Christianity and then they said, yeah, these people they're way more Christian and conservative than us. Um, you know, have you ever is there a quote in Arabic something like religion is the opium of the masses?
Yeah, yeah. الدين أفيون الشعوب. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of like they see. Um, I think that the Westernization argument really falls apart when you think that economic prosperity is usually correlated with secularism.
Hmm. Also, when Ikhwan ruled for a year, there were a lot of support from the United States, and also, uh, the West were trying. I mean, the Ikhwan party, uh, they had more welcoming places for them in the West than Egypt. I believe some of the operation are actually like their headquarter is actually in America or something. So the
Yeah,
yeah, I think this is, like, you are saying the West is not bad, and we shouldn't like listen to them or whatever, right? But people who are like very religiously, or from the Muslim Brotherhood, they go there and live there, and they have their headquarter there, and they do not want Egypt to turn, or they are saying Egypt is turning to Westernization, being a Western country or something. It's a little bit contradictory when we think about it.
yeah. Also, Egypt was always culturally diverse, right? Like you had these medieval stories around the time, the golden age of Islam, where there were sheikhs that were discussing like random, debates that are kind of like similar to like the Christian debates of like I think there was this one where is the Quran a creation or not? I think that debate happened at some point like where like this was an acceptable thing. It's an acceptable thing to discuss these kinds of things like the idea that secularism is a completely novel idea is completely false, right? You have the older people. I believe that Zahi Hawass, he's I think he's some kind of atheist hero. I think he's unironically just playing everyone at this point, right? I think he is the true soul of old Egyptian secularism, if you think about it, because he knows that there was no such thing as the Jews building the pyramids or the Jews being in Sinai for 40 years. He knows that there's no such thing as that. Um, and he's just like waiting until now to drop in that information. That's funny.
I would like to shift a little bit into a positive perspective towards how we could perceive Egypt future. And I would like to ask you if you see like any kind of hope moving forward when it comes to Egypt and its community.
Oh, definitely, definitely, 100%. Egypt is going to become way, way more livable, and it's already got way more potential, right? Yes, there will always be the classism problem, but I think that there is enough social mobility that life is bearable, right? Of course, we do have to make a conscious choice to engage in community. We cannot just continue this isolation urbanite lifestyle because I think there needs to be more focus on the kind of depression pipeline, the atheism to depression pipeline. Like instead of sitting and talking about philosophy or sitting and talking about like the ultimate thing to do is to leave. I think it's more like if we build a community and I do see that happening, right?
Mhm.
Maybe not with a like name or a label of religion behind it, but we do see a lot of groups. I think you also told me about the anonymous forum where people talk about, like, confess things, right? Cairo
Mm-hmm.
confessions.
Yep.
Yeah, but everything has to be a conscious choice. Like, it's definitely, we definitely have to have habit formation. Like, you cannot just do one thing once. You cannot, like, hang out at a park one time and call that community, right? Like, there is always going to be a conscious habit forming effort to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But the way I see it, I see that there are a lot more events popping up, and Egypt is definitely recovering from the Islam virus, the Wahhabism virus.
We have, I think, our generation witnessed the birth and the, I would say, the globalization of social media, right? It's literally everyone, most people, I would say, over 90% of the people have interacted once or twice with social media, and they could interact with people who have whose voices are not very loud, who are minority, and they would look into that and like understand that there is difference between people. So I would like to ask you about something. Do you think that since we have social media, internet, we have a lot of information places, places where we can find information on the internet, do you think that would be something that would make people less religious or more religious, since they are like more open to like the West, for example, or for they are able to have a discussion or debate about certain traditions or religious beliefs with other people who are not religious, and debate or discussion usually would make you think.
Yeah, I think I'm not really on the Arabic spaces, but the internet is very unpredictable, right? I would like to believe in optimism, but I have seen how specifically Facebook was not just like one country or two countries. It was used in multiple countries to affect the political landscape and promote nationalism and racism and all these isms of including tribalism. There was a incident where Facebook during an election period actually promoted gang violence and murdering people for their race. So I do think that the internet is a double-edged sword. It can definitely contribute to. I mean, I don't think all communities are magical wonder space. Religious communities are very toxic, and there is a possibility we can go down that direction. But there is, of course, a lot of Egyptian people told me that social media helped them discover and broaden their mind and like that kind of stuff. So I guess maybe it could be also used for the good.
Mm-hmm.
But I think your input would be more important in this because I'm not personally a user of Arabic social media.
Yeah, as you said, it could be like it could be used in either direction. I've seen incident where they were promoting, like as you said, hate towards certain community of people, and for us, Egypt here, we have seen incident where there were, I think there is a video that was resurfaced on the internet and took over in Facebook, Instagram, and a lot of places, that there were people who were talking about an incident where they met an atheist person, and they thought he's crazy, and they started to dox this person and say his name, his family, his friends, and try to give the people all the information so they would harass them. And they actually did harass him. All their information were publicly available, and the public opinion about someone who's atheist is not great in Egypt. And you would have people like, you know, uh, I'm not gonna say they were routing the street with pitchfork trying to hunt him down, but they did damage him on a mental side. They were trying to connect with his family and trying to tell them how bad they raised their son or something, and it wasn't fun at all. So it could be used. Social media could be used in a way very destructive to a certain group of people, and we were hoping that social media would get people together because you will be able to see another perspective, right? Seeing that there is differences between us, but that's not always the case. Some people would see difference as a threat. It's a danger to be not like me. If you're not like me, you're against me, something like that. And we have seen that there is a lot of incident of that. It's as I said, it's a double-edged weapon. It's a matter how you use it, and there is a lot of factors that are taken into consideration when it comes to social media and not. But it also have provided a place for people who might be who are not finding a community around them, or for a place to share ideas with people who are like-minded. So it's like a lot of things. It has its pros and cons. It's how you use it and how we, as a community and as a government or as a system, how we should regulate it and maybe forbid some action that could, threat the life of other. That's a big concern of social media.
Definitely. Yeah. Unfortunately, though, if you look at the polar landscape of the political West online, like the whole idea of what you just said, the doxing thing is also an accepted thing to do, and sometimes considered to be a moral thing to do. So I do think that we do have the internet as a whole is no longer really a safe space for counterculture, and yeah, that will be a problem. But the difference, I guess, I feel like this because I was out. I was out as with my religious identity in Egypt, and I didn't have any problems. And I understand that that's a unique experience compared to Egyptians, right? But I was out, and I felt like people were genuinely curious and genuinely interacted with me, with a little bit of like, wait a minute, you're still a human. That's insane. I've seen that happen a lot. Like, wait a minute, like you're actually still a human being. And then some people who just like extremely pissed off that that even is a thing, and like tried to sabotage me. But then just again, this plays into their victim thing. But at the end of the day, because it was we had something to do, something to work towards. There was more of a reason to see that experience as like, yes, I could be your neighbor, kind of experience. But unfortunately, with the internet, like when you're hiding behind a screen, there is less of that personal identification. I think once, instead of focusing on the label of who is what your religious identity is, but connecting with people and having, for example, a sport, and then you know making those like friendships with that identity in mind. I think that will have more of an impact. And social media, if you just use it to just find your niche in social media, you'll be able to, connect with people on something that you're actually interested in. I think it's so much easier to reach people by saying, hey, I'm a human being. I also have interest in this, or I also face this problem, or something similar like that. And then the idea of being less religious or accepting irreligious people will come with it.
Mhm. There is a common phenomena, I would say, that there is the less extreme version of Islam, where we coined a term for it. We called it the cute Islam, right? Some people would say this cute Islam, the kind of easygoing Islam, is going to be a much better alternative to the very restrict, very like trying to take control of everything in your own life. But the cute Islam is like very on the spiritual side more. What do you think of this cute Islam?
This is the ultimate question of like, should we reform or abandon religion? And I think abandoning religion is way, way more far away. I think it needs like 100 years maybe to happen. Some people say more. I'm not that pessimistic. But I do think reform is great because then, like yeah, like you have like the ones where like women pray alongside men. So like again, it increases the involvement in the street and involvement in this and that. The maybe this is my own personal thing because I'm a Western Muslim, or whatever. I think that I'm doesn't matter how I identify, I would still become a subset of Muslims. Like Westerners will not see me as something different. Um, and that's why I'm full on hoping and like betting on like what you call cute Islam, because right now the West is starting to become extremely radical and unsafe towards certain ethnicities and stuff like that. And it's like I would rather be in a place where I wouldn't be prosecuted for something that is very visible about me, like my race, um, compared to like something invisible, like being an atheist. And that's why I'm hopeful. I think that the Muslim world is not all of it, but at least in Egypt, it's definitely possible. It's definitely happening. I think one last thing I want to say is another thing that annoys me about the ex-Muslim community in Egypt is the focus on abstract philosophy and abstractions and chronic online behavior. I think that that is another thing, another problem, because I was mostly focusing on like solutions and what can we do, like learning a skill or involving yourself in a sport or whatever. But I think it's also important to mention that the ex-Muslim community in Egypt has these problems, right? Like they engage in abstract philosophy, and that's what makes them have an aversion to engaging in society and doing yoga because they think yoga is a religious practice, and therefore they should have just an opposition to religion just because. And they don't have an understanding of why spirituality was helpful for human societies and why we do need to have spirituality, or we do need to connect with Muslims and Christians, regardless uh, of our beliefs. And that's something that we have to reach out to do.
I really like the point where usually people who leave religion start to hate everything that relates even remotely to religion, even if it's something that could potentially be of a good value to this person, which is not a good thing in the grand scheme of things.
Yes, it's a big problem when with the like thinking you're an intellectual internet person and then you're reading philosophy. I think I take pride in saying I don't understand philosophy, despite the unfortunate fact that I actually do. I just don't like actively reading something that's so abstract and so far removed from the human experience.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you for joining us here, and I hope you had fun in this podcast.
Thank you for having me.